Good evening, everybody. I am Alan Mucatel, and I'm the CEO of Rising Ground and moderator for tonight's panel discussion, exploring the role of philanthropy in support of human services. This evening is the third in a series of panel discussions among several activities over the year marking the 190th anniversary of Rising Ground. Our first panel discussion covered the history of human services. The last one we held discussed issues of race in the provision of human services. You can view either of those prior discussions by going to our website, risingground.org/190th. If tonight is your first time joining us, welcome. And if you've participated in prior panel discussions, welcome back. As a reminder, Rising Ground began as Leek and Watt's orphan home in Lower Manhattan in 1831. It was created through the bequest of a vestry member of Trinity Church. Trinity Church has joined to partner with us in celebrating our 190th anniversary, and in particular, in sponsoring these panel discussions. We are deeply, deeply grateful to them for that support, along with their support of our work in the areas of intimate partner violence. In addition to Trinity Church, I would also like to thank Mutual of America, our 190th anniversary honoree and sponsor, as well as discussion series sponsors Alliant, Atlantic Tomorrow's Office, Lamb Insurance Services, and USI Insurance. So before we begin, I just wanted to say to all of you out there, if you have questions for our panelists, once the conversation gets going, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can towards the end of our program, all right? You're welcome to join in the discussion by asking your questions. Okay, on with the show. Tonight, we are looking at how human services are funded, specifically the role of philanthropy in the complex interplay between government and private support. Charitable or philanthropic giving, some $471 billion in 2020, comes from individual donors. I believe that's about 69% of the funding, foundations, and corporations. I'm delighted to welcome an esteemed group of experienced panelists to explore how human services are funded and what that funding matrix says about our society, how we got here, and where we are going. Let me introduce our panelists. First, Doug Bauer is the Executive Director of the Clark Foundation and the Scriven and Fernley Foundations. Doug brings considerable experience in philanthropy, both through his work with foundations and corporations, having served in leading roles with the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, the Goldman Sachs Philanthropy Fund, and the SmithKline Beecham Foundation, as well as the Pew Charitable Trusts. Greg Witkowski of Columbia University is a senior lecturer in the discipline of nonprofit management at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. Greg is the series editor of the Georgetown University Press series, Philanthropy, Nonprofit, and Non-Government Organizations. Michael Brown is the head of research at the Wharton Social Impact Initiative at the Wharton School of Business. Michael completed his PhD in 2019 at the University of Chicago, focusing on the history of social welfare provision in the United States. His dissertation specifically explored the causes and consequences of innovations in 20th century nonprofit human service organizations. Linda Gibbs was unable to join us tonight due to a last-minute family matter. We are, however, very grateful to Natasha Lifton for stepping in. Natasha is Director of Government Relations at Trinity Church Wall Street. Prior to joining Trinity Church, she served as Senior Program Officer for Human Services at the New York Community Trust, Director of Public-Private Partnerships at New York City Housing Authority, Senior Vice President at SEEDCO, and Director of Early Childhood Initiatives at the United Way of New York City. Thank you, Doug, Michael, Natasha, and Greg for agreeing to participate this evening. So we've got a lot of ground to cover here. I thought I would start with a somewhat rapid, asking for a somewhat rapid fire response to a big question. Among countries that have a relatively strong social safety net, the United States is somewhat unique in that it is reliant on private nonprofit organizations and private philanthropy for the provision of critical services. From your perspective, what is one benefit and what detriment to that structure? Doug, can I ask you to comment first?
Sure, Alan, and good evening, everybody. And Alan, thank you to Rising Ground and to Trinity Wall Street for the series and the session tonight. So one good aspect of what we have currently is, I think we have a human services community that is flexible, adaptable, nimble, and I think has demonstrated, their resiliency, especially over the last 20 or so months, and that's all to the good. I think one bad aspect of the system is that government is just clearly not funding the way that it should be funding that system. And we can maybe get into the reasons as to why a little later on, but with overhead not being paid for, contracts not being fully funded, this puts a tremendous stress and strain on the system, and that's a big problem.
Thank you. Greg, care to comment?
Sure, yeah, so there are two things I guess I would build on what Doug said and agreeing with him as well. One of the countries that I've done some research on is Germany, and Germany funds its social services as well through nonprofits. So it has a very robust social welfare system, but it works through really 5 core nonprofits. And historically, they've been associated with the different churches. And so one of which, the largest of which is the Protestant Diakonie. And they actually reach about 1/5 of the population of Germany with the various kind of programs they run, which begins from, kind of kindergarten type things and daycare, all the way up to elder care. They run hospitals, schools, all these sorts of things. And the key difference is they're well funded. And so that aspect really distinguishes the way that system, which runs through nonprofits, is from us. And there's one other distinction, though, that where maybe you might want to give the advantage to the USA in this case, which is there are basically 5 core nonprofits there delivering these services. So in terms of the differences among those 5, there really isn't the types of difference that you see in the United States. There's a certain consistency, which is a benefit in a lot of ways for public policy. But if you think about how do you reach diverse audiences, how do you engage with specific needs? Well, the US system, which has such a mass of nonprofits, allows for that as a possibility. And so if you look at that engagement potential with different communities, I think we have that here in our system in a way that a very well-funded service delivery program through nonprofits in Germany does not.
Thank you. Natasha, what are your thoughts?
So yeah, I would certainly build on what both Doug and Greg have said. I mean, I think the lack of funding is something that anyone in our field would immediately recognize. Government does not invest in human services the way that other advanced countries that have, really robust safety nets do. Our safety net here has gaping holes in it. We also don't have universal access, which many other countries, Scandinavian countries, many other European countries do have. So I think that's another serious flaw that a lot of people get left behind. In terms of positives, just building a little bit on what Greg said, I think that the richness of the sort of variety and diversity of nonprofits that we have means that we have organizations serving communities that are really of and for the communities they serve. And that is, I think, a huge benefit in terms of the kinds of services that are provided, the cultural competency. I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area, but I think we are probably better positioned than some other countries because of the richness of the nonprofit sector, which has really developed out of necessity because government really hasn't been there to provide the kinds of services that communities need.
Finally, Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised that with 3 experts weighing in on this, there isn't that much new to say at this point. But I guess the only thing that I would add is, in terms of advantage, yeah, there's as Doug pointed out, flexibility, adaptation, nimbleness, but there's also an element of experimentation, which in some case builds on that, but is also different. The nonprofit sector is sometimes thought of as a social laboratory of sorts, lots of different organizations experimenting with different approaches to human service provision. And theoretically, that would allow for at least the possibility of certain models to become more proven over time and just kind of rise to the top. I don't want to sound like I'm evangelizing too much for that, because I think it's actually a lot harder than it sounds. Often with human services, outcomes are really hard to specify with, in a definitive way, but it is theoretically a potential advantage. And then a disadvantage really quickly, again, sort of repeating what others have said, but also adding a bit of nuance, is just the duplication and fragmentation that comes with lots of different organizations. So it can be a bit like herding cats, I imagine, for public authorities to try to get different independent agencies to sort of move in step towards, those proven models that I mentioned before, if they do in fact become identified.
So on the positive, it sounded to me like you were all describing some things that are often talked about this country on the plus side, innovation, nimbleness, creativity, flexibility, all those things I think we try to hold up as positives in our country. But you very quickly narrowed in as a group on the funding piece. And so maybe we should start there in our discussion. And I would welcome, Doug, you sort of posed it as the question, and it's two sides to the funding piece. The point is that we're probably less expensive. Well, it's not probably. It's cheaper to turn to nonprofits to do the work. So I think there's one part of the question, which is, why is it that we care that it's cheaper for nonprofits to do the work? And then there's the other part of the question, which is, why is it that that government is not investing appropriately, whether it is fully funding, paying on time, supporting living wages among human service workers? Why is that? What does it say about us? And at some point, I'd want to know what our thought is about the role that philanthropy plays in either perpetuating that or not perpetuating it. So, Doug, since you kicked us off and down the financial path, I'll maybe ask you and then allow others to chime in when they see fit.
Sure. I mean, so, I think there's an array of reasons as to why we have the situation we have. And I think it might not, I doubt it's unique to New York City, but it seems particularly amplified in New York City right now. Look, and forgive me for being either small p or big P political, but the current administration in City Hall that is about to wrap up made some conscious choices. And some of the conscious choices, as it relied to sustaining the social safety net in the city, they decided that for whatever reasons, we're not going to really do it in as robust a manner as it needed to be, and that they were frankly going to nickel and dime. And I think they nickel and dimed, and in many cases shortchanged you, Alan, and your colleagues who run nonprofits in the human services arena in the city, in part because they knew they could get away with it. The lobbying rules and advocacy rules are fairly clear. I think there is some hesitancy and has been some hesitancy, and I get it. You don't necessarily want to bite the hand that hands you a contract from the city or state. But at the same time, you also want that contract to be a fair one. You want it to be paid on time. You want it to be a contract that actually covers the cost of you delivering the service in a quality way to the clients that you're trying to help. But you're also limited in how much you can really try and advocate and or put pressure on key opinion leaders within City Hall to make the right set of decisions. So I think there's a lot of things that put us where we are today. The good news is the incoming mayor-elect and the incoming comptroller, have launched a task force to look at all these issues. That's, I think, very exciting. They want recommendations and reforms within 60 days of January 1st, probably earlier than that. And it's remarkable that they're wanting to do this before they even take office. So that's perhaps some cause for some optimism after what has been a fairly difficult 8 years, and then of course compounded by what happened with the pandemic. there's a lot that's contributed to where we are, but in part, I think it's because the voice of the human services arena of community has not been heard as loudly as it probably should have been, certainly in City Hall, and I also think obviously in Albany as well.
I would just add that I think that there's, I certainly agree with all of that, but I think underpinning all of this are some very sort of uniquely American sort of ideologies that kind of underpin the system or systems that we find ourselves with in terms of human services. So the notion that the private sector can always do it better than government, has resulted in this very large network of private agencies providing services that government either used to provide or does provide in other countries. And I'm not judging that one way or another. I just think that that's one of the reasons why we have the sort of structure that we have now. And then, and this is more of a judgment, there's also a notion that, human services are for people who are not capable of taking care of themselves, the sort of notion of the undeserving poor. And that also comes from a very unique American ideal that everyone should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and all those sort of cliches. And so I think that those two pieces really have led us to what sometimes can be an effective way to deliver services, but often ends up in a very siloed and fractured system where you have agencies that really, you have government funding that's layered on top of each other as opposed to sort of intertwined. And so then you have agencies that are left to kind of piece all of that together and then supplement it with private funding, because as we've all made the point, the government funding never goes far enough. And so you have agencies that have to, and Alan, you know this much better than the rest of us, have to build a back office infrastructure to manage all of that, which takes away from the resources of actually serving people in need.
Well, Natasha, you just touched on something, and I guess it's a great opportunity to turn to two folks with a historical orientation a little bit, Greg and Michael. When Leek and Maoz was founded in 1831, most of the institutions that we rely on today, public education, a child welfare system, even entitlements like Social Security or Medicare, elder supports, or anything for people with developmental disabilities, just simply didn't exist, right? And so as a society, well, maybe you can offer a little bit of historical perspective and build on what Natasha, I think, was pointing to about how did we get here to the world that we have today in this country.
I can maybe pick up on the worthy, unworthy, which was really a very early piece. And then I know Michael has a rich understanding of this from his research. One of the key distinctions, and I think it's moved from charitable giving also to the general welfare system, is this conception of whether or not someone is worthy of help or unworthy of help, right? And the notion of to what extent is one responsible for his or her own plight, or to what extent is it a matter of circumstance? And of course, the sense of individual responsibility is really built into a lot of the American kind of mythology and ideology. And so I think we do see a lot more focus being placed on whether or not that individual does or does not deserve help. And so that definition of worthy and unworthy, but that's something that would have been there at the founding of Leeks and Watts. It's certainly orphans as people who really were born into this world without of any, no responsibility of their own, were in need of help, certainly would be among those who could be seen as the most worthy of recipients. But this debate about how to engage with people and their own personal responsibility for their situation, I think, is an ongoing one. And I'll turn it over to Michael, who I know will add a lot more depth to this.
Yeah, I mean, Natasha, of course, is correct that there is this ideology of valorizing the private sector and sort of assuming that it can do the job better than government. But there is also, of course, the parallel story of the increasing growth of the government and the increasing involvement of the state in at least attempting to guarantee and providing human services. I mean, in preparation for this, I actually tried to look up some past annual reports of Leak and Watts, and I found that in 1918, the annual report that I could track down, 44% of the organization's revenue came from government, and now it's something like 97%. So that is in cold hard numbers the story of the state's growing role in the human services sector. And we've talked about how the pros and cons of that, but it is ultimately a story, I think, of some degree of progressive reform starting in the late 19th century in earnest, and then proceeding through the New Deal and the Great Society and so on.
That research on rising ground, and I think that's Doug, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think this tension. Yeah, Michael, the picture behind Michael is College Hall at University of Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken, right, Michael? And the founder of University of Pennsylvania is Ben Franklin, and Franklin, at the beginning of this country, he was like, there's just going to be services or programs that are not going to be supported by government because they're going to be, he thought, politically unpopular. And there's going to be things that business will not do because they cannot make money doing it. And so there had to be this third sector. And I think there has always been, throughout the history of the country, and I'd be curious what Michael and Greg think of this tension between public, private, and then the third sector in between that tries to, in many cases, ameliorate some of the worst of those two sectors and making sure the disadvantaged or the poor are taken care of. And I think what's interesting to me, really, since 1980, really since the Reagan election in 1980, where he campaigned, and ever since there has been this ongoing mantra of market forces are better than government forces in solving social problems. I think that has been heard loud and clear, and in some cases, unfortunately, it's been heard loud and clear. But again, I think there's just been this tension for over 220 years of what is the right balance between public, private, and nonprofit to not only sustain a social safety net, but things like education, the arts, etc. So to me, it's been a constant. And then I think in the last 40 years or so, a real debate and battle around market versus government. And then how does nonprofits kind of wedge themselves in between that and try and get something done on behalf of in many cases, clients who are not able to move forward in society for whatever reason.
Greg, Michael, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think one of the pieces that strikes me are two separate things. One is this sense of innovation, and I think Michael alluded to this as well earlier, of an opportunity for experimentation and the best way to go forward on social solutions or social good. And I think part of the difficulty, of course, there is the fundamental, going back to our first point, the fundamental underfunding of all of this sector, so that so much is called upon foundations to fund some basic needs versus to think about how much can we allot to looking for more innovative solutions, or how much can we allot in other ways, right? So if you had a more robust system, and I'll go back to the German system is like this, foundations can really focus on social solutions, broader questions, right? So there's that underlying, and maybe it's too optimistic to hope for that here. But the other, I think, kind of misconception surrounding the nonprofit sector is that it's geared towards those who are less fortunate. And I think human services maybe, but if we look at higher ed, if we look at the arts, if we look at health and medicine, if we go across the board, it's really a middle-class organization, right? Now, the nonprofit sector really kind of meets a lot of middle-class needs. And, one of the things that I think we sometimes miss in looking at this is that it's, we tend to focus on the least advantage in terms of human services, but these other issues, I think, are out there in terms of what the nonprofit sector is providing for, who they're providing for, and a lot of them are more mainstream middle-class needs.
I want to challenge that point that you're just making there, Greg, if I can. My understanding is that among philanthropic giving, only 11 to 14% of the philanthropic dollars go to human services. And the rest of it goes to higher education, the arts, the environment, all of which, by the way, I want to be very clear, I think are very, very, very worthy causes. But my orientation as the CEO of a nonprofit human service organization and the focus of today is on human services. So the notion that less than 15% is actually going towards, and I think this speaks to, Natasha, your point that you started with, the deserving or undeserving, and that this idea of a social safety net. So what does that say about about our system, that such a disproportionately amount of money goes there? I mean, we have wonderful institutions, Harvards and the Yales with literally billions in their endowments, and huge fundraising capacities. Where is the place for human services in this? What does that say about philanthropy overall?
Let me just say, I'm sorry, Alan, I actually agree with you on that point, right? That
it's, I knew you would.
and those in need are really underfunded vis-a-vis middle-class needs. So just want to make that clear.
Sorry, I hope I didn't mean to present myself incorrectly about that. I assumed you would be agreeing there. Natasha, what were you about to say?
I was going to say that having worked at the New York Community Trust, which is New York City's community foundation and one of the oldest community foundations in the country, with a very robust competitive grant making program that's funded by the endowment, about between $50 and $60 million a year in grant making, and wide range human services, the arts, the environment, education, healthcare, youth development, workforce development, and then also very robust donor advised fund program. I think that donors tend to give to causes that are close to their heart. And for a lot of people, that's the school they went to. That's the hospital that took care of their ailing parent, or where they had surgery, or the school that they sent their children to. And so I think part of the challenge in philanthropy, beyond sort of institutional foundations, when you're talking about individual donors, is how do you broaden that sphere of what folks know about and are exposed to, and that they see as part of their community, because I think people have a very limited view of that. And I just saw a comment in the chat briefly. I just want to make clear that the undeserving versus the deserving is, in my opinion, a false structure, that there is no such thing as an undeserving person. Everyone is a human being. I mean, I work for a faith institution, and we deeply believe in the humanity of all individuals, regardless of their circumstance. And their circumstance could be illness, it could be incarceration, it could be homelessness, it could be a wide range of things. And the social sector is really there to address those needs, regardless of what others, or what the sort of societal view may be of deserving and undeserving. I had a professor way back at Hunter College who had written extensively on this, maybe Abramovitz. And when you look at this, was the one thing that really stuck with me in her class. When you look at our two national healthcare programs, Medicaid and Medicare, well, we care for the old, but we have to aid the poor, right? And so that to me is the sort of false dichotomy that sort of underpins so much of how services get funded, and the lack of funding for services for folks who really need as much help as possible, and who, when we help them, the old adage that all boats rise together, or whatever it is, that that you help one person, you help a community, you help yourself. And so I think a lack of understanding of that. And I would say, to Michael's point, that yes, it's true that there has been there was a huge growth in government spending, but to Doug's point, it's been shipped away for years now, since the Reagan era, where government was really viewed as the enemy, get government off our backs, and welfare queens, and all of those stereotypes. And we have been desperately trying to, climb our way back to a level of investment that would really truly meet the need.
I think to be just a bit more, oh, sorry, Alan, go ahead.
Oh, please go ahead.
Just to follow up on your question about like, what does this mean? The fact that donors tend to give to already well-endowed universities, for example. To be a bit more sort of normative about it, I think it means that you basically don't want to build a welfare state on the benevolent whims and impulses of individuals. You want some degree of centralization and sort of expert oversight. There is a balance to be struck there, of course, but one of the great scholars of the nonprofit sector is a man named Lester Solomon, who back in the 1980s had this like framework of different philanthropic failures, and one of them is philanthropic particularism. So that's in this framework, that's just sort of an inbuilt feature of philanthropy, that you're going to have people who are giving within their own community to their own pet causes. And that's great to an extent, but at some point, you do want to have more of an objective mechanism for delegating these resources. Yeah, so I would put that out there.
So I somewhat of a suggestion that might be one of the shortcomings, in addition to specifically how our system of human services is funded, is more broadly that it may not be able to be funded appropriately if we're counting on philanthropy to make up for where government is not able to deliver. Which I guess begs the question, Doug, and I think you're about to chime in. Really, what is that interplay between the private sector, private philanthropy, and government in ensuring that we have provided the services, social safety net that we hopefully all might agree on?
Sure. Well, first of all, I mean, just to be clear, it's not philanthropy's job, broadly speaking, to fill the gaps of government. That's not, and it's never been philanthropy's role. And I think that's especially true in the human services arena. But that's what we are doing right now in the city of New York, because these contracts are not, fully funded, because indirect costs have been pulled. In many cases, those gaps are being filled with general operating support dollars, dollars that are raised at galas, et cetera, to cover some of the costs on a contract that's paying you, Alan, 80 cents on the dollar. And so you got to find that other 20 cents. We hear that over and over and over again from our grantee partners in New York City. And that's not what the role of philanthropy should be. To me, the role of philanthropy should be Paul Elvisaker, who back in the 60s was one of the leaders at the Ford Foundation, when he was, in a social situation and someone would ask him, well, what's the role of philanthropy? And he would say the role of philanthropy is to be the passing gear for society, right? And so in my mind, I would dearly love at some point for philanthropy to return to that role in human services, to provide the dollars to you, Alan, and your colleagues to go out and test, new ideas or new ways of thinking or new ways of executing program, and to help you advance what you're doing. And the other thing I'd say, there was a symposium back in September by the Center for Urban Future on where is New York going post pandemic, and there was one panelist who said, and it was also in the context of providing advice for the next administration. And one panelist said, I think we should do 100 pilots, right, across the issue areas in New York City, and the ones that fail, and the ones that turn out to be okay, let's scale them up. And I almost had an allergic reaction to that, although I was very polite and kept quiet. But my point is that no, let's not stop the pilots. We know what works. Alan, you and your colleagues know what works. And so what do we take of what works and help to amplify, scale, advance that work, and get government to be the ones that fully underwrite it? That's where we need to be. That's where we need to go. And I think, I am hoping, Mayor-elect Adams said he's going to be the get stuff done mayor. Well, this is a good get stuff done topic for him. Let's really look at the work that you and the others, Alan, are doing that is demonstrating real results with passion and compassion to your clients and the communities that you're serving, and let's move that forward. And that's what philanthropy should be helping with, not filling in the gaps where government is not funding what they should be funding.
Can I just weigh in on that? Because that is very, very near and dear to my heart. When the time that I spend at the trust, I always look to fund, if it was a direct services grant, I look to fund a program that was effective, but that also aligned with government priorities, with the idea that it would then position it for scaling. And we're actually able to achieve that with the Fair Futures program, which Alan knows well. But that's an effort to help youth aging out of foster care with very robust academic and coaching supports. And myself and several other funders, we had a funder collaborative that I oversaw at the trust, focused on improving child welfare outcomes. And the city had released a report, a set of recommendations for improving foster care. And two of them spoke directly to programs, privately funded programs that several child welfare agencies in the city had been funding. And so we basically went to government and said, here are 3 or 4 agencies that are running programs, have developed and are running programs that directly align with these 2 priorities that you've identified. They're being completely privately funded, but they are helping you achieve the goals that you want to achieve. And so we as private funders are willing to underwrite helping to scale this initiative by providing technical assistance, by developing a model that draws on each of these best practice programs, developing a model that incorporates all of those best practices, and then funding the kind of infrastructure, so a data collection platform. And then at the same time, we also funded an advocacy campaign. So we used an inside-outside strategy. So we worked with city government to say, we're willing to help you achieve this goal, but you've got to put some money on the table. And then when they didn't put money or enough money on the table, we then funded advocacy, hired a lobbyist, hired a communications firm to put pressure from the outside. And, I will say over 3 years, and I've spent 34 years doing policy and advocacy work in the nonprofit sector, I've never seen this kind of response where in the first year we got $10 million, and in the second year we got $12 million, and then in the year of the pandemic we got $20 million. And so because we very intentionally went to government at the very beginning to say, here's how philanthropic dollars, the investment we've already made in supporting these programs and the investment we're willing to make now to help you achieve your goals. And, not surprisingly, they were amenable to that partnership. Now, it wasn't always, there were definitely conflicts. There were definitely times when they said, we have other priorities or we have other funding needs. We can't go, to the Office of Management and Budget and ask for the money that you want. But it was from the very beginning a true public-private partnership, and I think the way that philanthropy can have the greatest impact.
I wanted to say, if you didn't get us to talk about Fair Futures, I would have made us talk about Fair Futures.
I'm always going to talk about it.
And you remember, you're a surprise guest in the last minute, so it was even better. But I was just going to say that I agree. I think that is one of the most interesting examples, certainly that I've been able to participate in reflecting how private philanthropy, in this case, foundations, not individual support, but foundations, could really reshape the direction, in this case, of child welfare, specifically foster care, and is uniquely New York. I guess, Doug, for all the things that maybe have not popped out of the last administration that were positive, this would be an example of something that is really tremendous, and the philanthropic community role in that cannot at all be understated.
It's a real case study, Alan.
It's a real case study. It really
Can
is.
I just add just one more piece, because so you mentioned that this was foundation funding that did this. I will say that when I was at the trust, I often presented this to our individual donors who were their donor advised funds, because they're giving relatively small amounts of money to individual agencies, and you might not want to hear this, but they wanted to see how they could direct their money to something that would have broader impact, that would really across a system rather than, supporting a group of 25 youth. And so I have to say, just in presenting that to individual donors, it really resonated with them. The idea that their contribution could be part of an effort to really drive broader systemic change.
And that of course speaks to some of the unique role of community foundations and foundations that are funded in that way, for sure. Let's change. There was a comment that I saw earlier in the chat that made me think to ask this question, and it certainly ties back to the recent panel that we had on race and human services, and where communities of color in particular, but in asking this question, not exclusively, have been left out in the services that have been offered. And some would say that the human services sector is ameliorating, but not fundamentally changing systems that cause harm in the structures that we have in this country, and that philanthropy is complicit in that, in the same way that we are not making that kind of progress. I was wondering what your thoughts are about that criticism that's lodged against nonprofits and human service providers and philanthropy, and to what degree that you think it is true that both philanthropy and nonprofit service sector can affect positive structural change, and both from their examples historically, but also in general. Thoughts on that?
Maybe just to give this a historical flavor, a big debate in the 60s and 70s was the so-called income strategy versus services strategy. Services being, the provision of, well, I don't want to say services, but essentially non-income based methods of support. But the alternative strategy, which is giving cash to poor folks, and which sounds like radically simple, but in many ways was framed as the actual structural approach to dealing with these problems. And for various reasons, the income strategy sort of fell away over time. There's elements of it still in TANF and the earned income tax credit and SNAP, but there was never really a guaranteed annual income that really took flight in the US. And I think that's personally, I think that's a shame. And as long as that is the case, that we allow poverty to exist in the US, yeah, I mean, the nonprofit human services sector will always sort of be playing a Band-Aid role. But I should also mention that a lot of human service organizations do a whole lot of advocacy, and that's also really important to keep in mind.
It does seem to be a broader systemic issue. There was a Bridgespan study a year or so ago, 2020, that looked at early stage nonprofits in Harlem. So precisely kind of the area where you might think there would be opportunities for coming to terms with some of the racial and social injustices. And so the study, and I'll just read it off quickly here, I found it in my notes. Disparity in revenues and unrestricted assets between white-led and black-led early stage organizations. White-led or black-led organizations had on average 24% less average revenues. So again, in the same area, serving the same communities. And in terms of unrestricted net assets, white-led organizations had, or black-led organizations had 76% less than white-led organizations. And so, so we're looking at not only about the question of, do you create and find ways to address the issues, we're also looking at who's leading these, to what extent do we have representation within these organizations, and to what extent can we get engaged then more broadly with community needs. So, despite being a historian and seeing a long history of racial injustice and recognizing that, I was still a bit surprised to see those numbers starkly in our face about contemporary situation here, looking specifically at leadership of those different organizations in the human services.
Natasha, any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, Yeah, no, I mean, I think Greg and Michael have shared some good thoughts. I think in the city of New York right now, and again, you know, the opportunity with a change in administrations, which just provides a new opportunity, and I don't think we can discount it. I mean, it's a new mayor. It's for the most part a brand new city council. We'll have a new speaker. We have a new comptroller. There's varying degrees of knowledge. You know, in City Hall, in City Council, although there are 6 new City Council members who come from the nonprofit sector, which I think is very exciting. But I think there's a central question that we need to ask ourselves moving forward in the city of New York. Are we going to manage poverty or are we going to fight poverty? And I think that's a real central question. Right now, the city of New York, through 8 agencies, the Human Services Council of New York put together this information. There's $16 billion that flows through those 8 agencies, of which $6.5 to $7 billion goes out in contracts to nonprofit human service agencies. Without even asking for additional money, whether it's coming from city coffers or federal or state coffers, or it's ARPA money or whatever, just that 16 billion, only 6.5 to 7 is going to contracts. That means the balance, almost 10 billion, is sitting in those agencies. Some of it goes to some service, but a lot of it is compliance and administration. Why don't we just have a conversation about how that money is going to be utilized going forward as just one place to start? But, and I think the other thing too, and Ellen, you know this, you know, 80% of the services are provided by 20% of the agencies. They tend to be the larger agencies like Rising Ground. That does put, in some cases, the community-based organizations, 6 figures, 7 figures in revenue, at a disadvantage to be part of the solution. And so I think there's a conversation that, and a lot of those smaller organizations are led by leaders of color. So there's a conversation that needs to be had within the human services sector itself about how we're, you know, to me, it's more a confederation of agencies. Do we want to move to a system of agencies that then gets really at that fighting poverty question rather than a managing poverty question in all its aspects? That's big, that's gnarly, but that is, I think, very central to how we move forward as a way to sustain and maintain a social safety net that really is going to help advance people's lives in however that's manifested. And that really does need to occur in my estimation.
I was just going to add that, just building off of what Greg noted, the statistics that he shared, that, you know, there is just an incredible level of disparity. I don't think we should be surprised that systemic racism stretches into the nonprofit sector. But, you know, when you think about, you look at most human services agencies in the city, the large ones are led by white people, but primarily staffed by people of color. And the other piece that I wanted to mention was, you know, there was a very conscious effort back in the, I guess, sort of mid to late 80s in the child welfare system to launch or to support the sort of standing up of child welfare agencies led by people of color. And almost all of those agencies, I think only one, there was maybe 10 around the time that were launched, and only one of those is still in operation. And so I think there needs to be a reckoning with understanding why that happened. Why, when there was a very conscious effort and a very, I think, good-hearted effort to establish agencies led by and for the communities being served in the child welfare system, and that all but one have closed, I think is really shameful, and something that should be explored so we can better understand why that happened.
There was a lot in the answers that you have each given there that I think I agree with you. I think there's a lot in those answers that require, I'm wondering, I'm gonna make a comment later about doing more of these panel discussions. I think that one is very fertile ground for more discussion. So I really appreciate the depth of your answers, but we're getting close to the end of our time. And so I wanna ask a final question that is more future oriented. in some way, Doug, you may have already provided your answer, but maybe you'll think of another one for this. But if you can envision the best possible role for philanthropy in the provision of human services, what would it be? I'm speaking specifically of the role of philanthropy in the role of human services, and how would the other players, mostly government, fit in with that? So as a concluding thought, and who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first because I think I've already said it, and it builds on what Doug said. But I think, you know, the role of philanthropy is really to test and scale effective approaches, and then partner with government on really institutionalizing them, and to do that in a way that, you know, again, aligns with government priorities, achieves the kinds of outcomes that government programs want to see achieved, because ultimately it will, you know, save them. If we're looking at prevention, it will save them money down the road in much costlier services. And so I think, you know, philanthropy has a critical role to play in providing those resources up front to be able to test those approaches and then really partner with government on scaling the most effective ones.
So I agree completely with what Natasha just said. I guess to alternatively, in the world that we live in right now, and given that government contracts often fail to cover overhead and don't allow for funds to be used for rainy day funds and all of that, given those circumstances, and as long as they persist, I really think that philanthropy, unfortunately, does have a bit of a gap filling role to play. It shouldn't be like that, but that, alas, that's where we are. And so I think that philanthropic funders really need to step up with providing unrestricted funding and making sure that those deficits are covered. That general operating support is the lifeblood of nonprofit organizations. And as long as government contracts are not flexible enough, then hopefully philanthropists can be.
I guess in a sense, I'll echo a lot of what's been said. But I guess taking past this prologue, we look to Germany in the 19th century in creating our social welfare system. Perhaps we can look again in creating a system in which we have well-funded nonprofits and relying upon foundations and others to look for new experiments to try to find better solutions. Perhaps also, though, adding a much more diverse approach to it as well, which we don't see as much in Germany, but I think we could certainly adapt to the United States, where we have different communities and different needs. I'm going to have to say goodbye at this point. I've really appreciated the discussion, but I actually have a class to join here in a minute. So thank you all, and thanks for hosting this.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, appreciate that. Doug, final thought on this question?
Yeah, no, I think so. Amen, Michael, to your call for general operating support. The Clark Foundation has for years been a general operating support provider. Close to, in 2020, 85% of the dollars we granted out to our 84 grantees, 83 grantees was general operating support. So we're big believers in it, and we try to do as much multi-year general operating support as we can. And yes, it fills gaps, but the other thing it does is it provides some real flexibility for the organizations we support to also become real strong advocates. I'm a firm believer in the Forces for Good model, that you have nonprofits that are very good at what they do day in and day out. They learn and evaluate what they do. They're very clear about how they move clients forward in a progression that helps that client succeed in whatever they're trying to do. And they take that practice and push it up and out to try and change policy. And those are the kinds of organizations that we're interested in supporting, and the best way to support them is with general operating support. So we're totally for that. And it was exciting to see that many foundations, broadly speaking, during the pandemic shifted to general operating support dollars. That's great. What we need to do is keep that momentum going in the right direction. I think Center for Effective Philanthropy and others are a little concerned that perhaps we're creeping back to targeted support. Not that that's a bad thing, but clearly at this moment in time, especially for the human services agencies, I think general operating support coming from private sources is the most important money to provide.
With that, I'm going to say a big thank you first to everybody who's joined us this evening to participate and listen in on this discussion. We are glad that you could make it. And in particular, I want to say thank you to our panelists, Doug Bauer, Natasha Lifton, Michael Brown, and Greg Witkowski. As we close the 190th anniversary panel discussions for this year, since we've gotten such positive feedback about them, I think I alluded to this earlier, we're considering continuing them in some form or fashion in the years ahead. And so we'll be back in touch with you, each of you who are here tonight and joined us tonight, to announce further discussions. Our 190th anniversary year-long celebration comes to an exciting finish with our annual gala. Since we are talking about philanthropy, if I didn't do a plug for fundraising, I would not be a good CEO. It is held on March 7th. You can find out more information about the event and more information about Rising Ground at www.risingground.org. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a great night.